They don't teach you how to be creative when you study a science. They assume it happens. It might work a lot better if they taught you to go into altered states and see things from a quite different perspective.
Charlie, it's so good to see you. I checked, the last time we spoke was in August 2007, over 13 years ago. So what's been happening in parapsychology, ESP research, after 8 months of sheltering, I think we're all starting to see strange things.
Yes, I think we are starting to see strange things. In terms of parapsychology, I don't think much is happening. Okay, I've been thinking about this because I realize now instead of this smart alecky young kid coming into the field and questioning my elders' ideas on what should be done, I'm one of those elders, and we got a lot of smart alecky young kids, but I don't think they are getting the results we need. And by that I mean, to me, the biggest problem in parapsychology is to make psychic phenomena more reliable and stronger. We need to increase the signal to noise ratio. And a lot of these new folks that are coming from a background of physics or something like that, and they're saying very impressive things, but they're not showing any evidence that they can produce stronger psychic flows within laboratory studies. And until we do that, I don't think that progress is going to happen. I mean, it's
Well,
nice that people can talk about it mathematically, but I'm old-fashioned. I think the proof that you have some better understanding is you make stuff work better, not just that you talk about it fancy.
I agree with you, but the skeptic kind of boiling in my stomach tells me the reason they can't do it is it's not there to be done. That this has been going on a long time. I mean, I had interest. I followed your work in the early days. In fact, I think I might have told you, but I actually was writing letters to J.B. Ryan at Duke, who I know you worked with in
Really?
the early 1960s, and he invited me down to consider a PhD program with him. So I was taking this seriously. I decided to go to neurophysiology instead, but I've followed the field, and frankly, I hear today less than I used to hear.
Well, to me, the height of the field was the approximately 20 years that there was government support for remote viewing. And that was a stronger amount of psi with practical sorts of uses. And I was a consultant on the program, so I know about some of the stuff that's otherwise classified and that doesn't make it out into the public. But uh, a lot of times it didn't work, but sometimes it worked really well.
So maybe what we're dealing with, if there is any veracity whatsoever, is a phenomena that is, in some sense, not as dependent upon the scientific method as traditional, as all the other sciences are. Now that sounds like a rationalization in that someone would say, yeah, but if you can't show it, that means it doesn't exist. But there's so much anecdotal evidence and some scientific evidence that could the phenomena be something of a different character, such that the scientific method as classically designed would not be able to sift out the signal from the noise.
Well, that may be, but I think there's still a lot to be learned by applying basic science to it. But we have to recognize that parapsychology is one of the hard sciences, not the easy sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, all that sort of stuff. And I know I'm reversing the usual stereotype about the hard sciences here,
Right.
but the fact is, if you're investigating the chemical properties of something, you as an experimenter are neutral. If you technically know how to do stuff, the experiments can be replicated, the findings can be applied, and so forth.
Right.
But once you get into parapsychology, and I think this is true for a lot of psychology too, the qualities of the experimenter really matter. Now, we don't want to know that, okay? we have this idea of the scientist as a brilliant person who works by logic and sheer acuity of observations and then logically reaches conclusion. And that probably happens once in a while. But the mood you're in, the unconscious processes going on make an enormous difference. So if you talk about replicating a successful parapsychology experiment, for instance, how do you use the same experimenter both times, or an experimenter who is equivalent in all ways that matter? We don't begin to understand the psychology of the experimenter and how it works. We know that this is the factual data aspect of it. There are some experimenters who, when they do a parapsychology experiment, they almost always get a significant result. And there are others who never get a significant result. And they may look the same to the outside observer, but think about the logic of it. If you're investigating what we call telepathy, you're saying, I think there might be a channel of information flow between people that's not conducted through the usual senses. So I can't see with instruments or my usual human senses whether it's operating or not. Okay, we also know that people affect each other. Okay, anytime you do a parapsychological experiment, then the experimenter is not just a recording instrument over in the corner. The experimenter is part of the experiment. And if you don't specify the qualities of the experimenter and what really matters, you've missed out on a major part of the measurement. Let me give you a specific example of that. When the remote viewing project started at Stanford Research Institute back in the early 70s, I was a consultant on the project. And I had known Russell Tart particularly. We'd met before that even started, and was very impressed by him as a physicist and so forth. But when he told me about the strength of the parapsychological information they got sometimes, I was very puzzled. This was a lot more than you usually see in the academic experiments where a professor takes a sample of college sophomores and does some kind of experiment with them. And I asked him a number of times, what do you do to create the psychological conditions to make it work? And he would look at me like, huh? I'm a physicist, I'm a scientist, I do experiments. When I finally actually visited their laboratories, I understood what an incredibly powerful psychological setup they had there that they didn't even realize. First off, I pull up to a place that does classified experiments. I can't just walk in. I come into the front desk, my identity is checked. I don't go any further until somebody who's already a staff member there comes down and gives me a temporary badge to walk through the building. They take me up to their laboratory. It's a couple of buildings away, so we cut through some other laboratories rather than long ways around in the hall. And these laboratories are full of the most interesting looking instruments, and the lights are flashing and the oscilloscopes are displaying and all that. And I realized, wow, I'm in a temple of big science. This is really something here. Then they take me to their lab and show me results of some of the experiments they got. And just straightforwardly, they're not describing something strange. It's just, we did this experiment and here was this description we got. And they said the swimming pool was 80 by 60, but it was really 82 by 58. So it wasn't perfect. Wow. Both him and Hal Puthoff were so used to being physicists, where you can pretty much ignore the qualities of the experiment and you're extremely high prestige to begin with, that they've got a very powerful psychological setup to make things go. And those experiments were extremely successful for approximately 20 years until basically they got too well known to the public and politicians could make a lot of headlines by denouncing this waste of the taxpayers' money on woo-woo stuff and all that. But I forget the exact figure now, but when somebody says, if this stuff didn't work, how come various intelligence agencies came back more than 700 times asking for remote viewings of various hidden sites? Boy, I can't think the intelligence agencies are that dumb that they couldn't tell whether they were getting valuable information or not. But that's not the way parapsychology is usually done.
but it hasn't been continued. You would think the intelligence agencies, and so many of them, and they compete with each other. If anybody thought there was some way here to do something that other people could not in their competitive environment, they would be killing to try to do this. And yet it seems to have faded away.
It didn't got fade away, it got pushed away because of the political hay that could be made of it. I know, for instance, one of the Army's best remote viewers, Joe McMoneagle, and he tells me about a prominent senator who saw some of the stuff they were doing, and he happens to run into this senator once in a while in kind of social circles in Washington, and the guy literally backs out of the room because he's convinced these remote viewers they're working with the devil or something like that. There's a little more than just simple scientific logic involved here.
Well,
So
that's a different reason. So that fellow thought it worked, but it worked because of demonic influence. So
yeah,
so as you reflect back, what are the categories of the strongest demonstrations of parapsychology, ESP, that cannot be explained by normal physics?
I don't think in terms of the strongest demonstrations. I think in terms of the bulk of experimental results. Yeah, occasionally some of them have been extremely strong once in a while. Others have been significant, but, okay, not all that overwhelming. And it's the sheer bulk of them. It's now, I gave up counting long ago. It's now several thousand experiments accumulated over the past 100 years or so. Most of them done without proper backing or much help or financial aid or all that sort of thing. But it's just happened over and over again. As a scientist, I make the experiment that if somebody says there's no scientific evidence for ESP, I'll say that person is either ignorant or they've got some kind of agenda they're trying to push. And a lot of the pseudo skeptics are pushing an agenda because they lie about how experiments come out.
What is the implicit danger of experimenters reporting data or experiments that work, but don't report null experiments because they either just don't, or they rationalize it that there was some error in it or whatever? And so you have a bias by a selection effect, maybe even unconsciously, in terms of those so-called thousands of experiments which have demonstrated ESP to one degree or another, but maybe there are tens of thousands that had no result.
I think you know the answer to this one, Robert, that this worry came up in parapsychology long before it came up in the rest of science. It was called the file drawer effect, all these experiments that didn't work that you never mentioned. Well, just judging from my own work alone, I seem to have done several hundred, if not 1,000 experiments that didn't work. I wonder where I got the time. You can judge by the statistical odds on the ones that do get published, how many ones that didn't work there must be are. It's a pseudo argument. There aren't all those things. I know all the people. There's about 3 parapsychological experiments done for every one that's published. If it was just chance, there should be at least 20 done for every one that's published. It's just one way of not dealing with it. The way people get illogical to make this evidence go away is very surprising. And I think there's a fear of it. If you look at human history, it's not very long ago that most cultures routinely burned witches at the stake. If they thought you could do this stuff and find out your secrets or affect you or something like that, and this wasn't somehow worked into a positive use for the society, it was considered highly dangerous. We're not that long removed from that kind of attitude.
I'm trying to discern what it would mean if everything you say is true, in terms of the number of scientific experiments that demonstrate a statistically valid effect that is not explainable in traditional scientific or traditional physics term, because the effect seems at best on the margin. I think you have to agree with that, because if the effect was strong and it could be demonstrated repeatedly, then it would have much more support and certainly much more credibility in the scientific community. But it doesn't. And so, if it is indeed the case that there is an effect, as you've been a great proponent of, why would that be? What is it? What is the nature of the ESP activity that enables this obviously remarkable activity, whether it's telepathy or where you have communication between different minds? I mean, you can make some physical argument how that could occur, but when you get to precognition, where you know something in the future, or clairvoyance, where you have some sense of a non-animate object in some way, or move it, psychokinesis. I mean, that's such a violent disruption of the physical order that we think is the way the world works. If that's the case, why isn't it stronger?
I'll tell you an interesting observation I made over the years. I started going to the annual meeting of the Parapsychological Association back in the 60s. And it was very interesting. There'd be, usually a dozen, 2 dozen or more research papers presented, hot new results. And most of those papers were marginally significant. That is, they were statistically significant, okay, to be published. The odds were 100 to 1 or something like that, or at least 20 to 1 and so forth. Once in a while, usually someone new to the field, would present an experiment which yielded a much stronger effect. The odds were thousands to 1 or something like that. Now, in most fields I can think of, if somebody gets this stuff to work much better than everybody else, everybody wants to know, how do you do it? I want to start doing that same thing. What happened at the Parapsychological Association meetings year after year was that there would be immense criticism of the people who were presenting really strong ESP results. And I think this demonstrated a complicated fear of psychic ability. I've called it the religion of the 5% level. That if you do a parapsychological experiment and the results are significant with odds of 20 to 1, 5 in 100, intellectually, you know something has happened and the mystery has been proven or something like that. But it's still a pretty weak effect, practically.
Right.
Instead of guessing 50%, which is chance in a thing, somebody guessed 51%. Well, that means almost all the time they're still just guessing, but once in a while they got this extra shot by ESP. But when it's really big, then I think the question of fears of ESP really starts rising up. And I think most parapsychologists are not interested in dealing with that. Again, whether it's the work of the devil, whether it's more practical stuff like will really be rejected by mainstream science if we have really strong effects. There's unknown psychological dynamics there. Now, I'm not a clinician. I started training in the clinical track, but decided I didn't have enough emotional intelligence to do that well. But it's clear to me there's some heavy unconscious psychological stuff going on here with the way people deal with this. If you can keep it at just an intellectual game, it's sort of safe. If it gets stronger than that,
That's a fascinating kind of social observation of the field, and because it's not the field in isolation. It's embedded within society, and society certainly has very strong opinions about ESP. Some people would love it, and therefore and go from there to all sorts of occultism or gurus or various kinds of speculations that they go. Some people think it's a devilish thing from a religious, maybe a Judeo-Christian perspective. So I do appreciate that, but let's clear all that social stuff out of the way, because I love to think about how the world is really working, independent of the social conventions at the time, and which is why I've appreciated your work over the years, which I've followed with great pleasure. And so if your claim is correct, that ESP is a real phenomenon, parapsychology is real, and there are stronger effects that could be had, although we recognize that it's certainly not at the point where it would be easily accepted. I want to try to understand what are the potential mechanisms by how it could work. And let's take each of the big four categories: telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis. How could it work? What are the potential mechanisms?
Well, I'm going to start with the hardest one first, and that's precognition.
Right.
When I look at the ESP experiments, where basically they say, in the future, some randomization process is going to scramble some targets, but would you please write down now what the order of those targets will be? It works as well as real-time ESP experiments usually. When I look at those results, I have a very difficult time because I say, look, the methodology is perfect. There's no doubt they're getting an effect. And I guess it means that information is coming from the future. And one part of my mind goes, huh? Information from the future? That makes no sense at all to me. And yet the funny thing now is that a number of these parapsychologists who have been trained as physicists think actually precognition may be the most basic form of ESP, and they use it to explain away other kinds of things. So, for instance, clairvoyance, knowing about the physical state of things that are shielded from you. When you think about that, you think somehow information from that distant place is crossing space, going through barriers into your mind, your brain, and somehow these people say, no, what quantum physics says, you couldn't have that sort of thing or something. But they say quantum physics allows for information coming back from the future. So if you correctly get some good clairvoyance results, it was some unconscious part of your mind listening to the feedback you get later on when the experimenter says, this is what the order was, and you're talking about it now. And I think, what? I can't understand precognition at all, and now it's a more basic thing. I just accept the fact that I'm puzzled on that. As far as telepathy, originally people were very excited with the discovery of brain waves because they thought, oh, there's electrical activity in the brain. It must be some kind of mental radio. Well, I was a radio engineer before I got into these other things. I know what it does to send information by radio waves. You simply don't have this strong enough transmitter to do it, much less the mechanisms. It doesn't show any of the qualities you would expect if it was electromagnetic radiation like radio. Clairvoyance, what sends the information? So, if somebody's looking at a deck of cards and they're off in another room, you can think their mind is somehow saying, this is an ace, send it. This is a king, send it, something like that. But suppose it's a clairvoyance experiment. The deck of cards has been shuffled very thoroughly and put back in the box. Nobody knows what the order is, and you're asked to write down the order, and you do significantly well. Well, it's just patterns of ink on pieces of cardboard. What's the mechanism for sending it out? I don't know. It'll call for a huge expansion of physics, probably when we get an explanation that's really useful for clairvoyance and telepathy or precognition. Or, as you pointed out, when you introduce this sort of thing, it may mean a quite different kind of science is needed to make sense of this. I still accept the idea that there will be a science in the sense that will understand causal factors that determine whether something happens or not, what its qualities are, and so forth. And it's worth our while to investigate those. I could be wrong, but in science, you find out by whether or not you actually get results, not by deciding ahead of time what you can and can't get.
The experimental data, as even the week that excited me and impressed me literally as a teenager, which got me in so interested in the whole area, was that at whatever level the statistical significance was, and that's a separate conversation, but whatever it was no different in telepathy dependent upon the distance. So if the distance were literally shielded sitting across the table or across the city, that the statistical result would be the same. And as you said, and in a precognition experiment, it would also be the same. So if you look at any of these, the level of statistical significance is at the same level. Now, to me, maybe simplistically, I see only two possible explanations for this. Number one, you won't like the number one, is that the statistical significance is an aberration and there's really no effect whatsoever. The second is that the mechanism involved, and I'm not going to use the word physics because it potentially would be beyond physics, but the mechanisms involved is of a totally different character than anything else we're used to.
I like number two.
Yeah, I don't know number two.
I've heard the hypothesis that our statistics are not really valid. If that's true, then dozens of other sciences are going to fall by the wayside because they use the same basic analysis techniques.
Yeah, and you know, that's not an impossibility. There's been, you know, a lot of studies recently that shows 40% of psychology, peer-reviewed psychology work is non-repeatable. So, I mean, there are complexities here.
Yes.
But to follow you on number two, because, you know, I hope number two is correct. I mean, I like this stuff. I hope it's real, but I'm not going to fool myself. And I know you've used that phrase yourself. I mean, that's one thing. Maybe you know, I've used it a lot. Maybe I learned it from you. I don't remember, but I know you've said that, and I like that. But I look at one of the biggest mysteries in fundamental physics is the vast differential between the power of gravity and the power of electromagnetism. So I forgot what that is. Like 10 to the 40th difference in power. And one of the theories is, just one, is that the reason is that gravity is sort of leaking through multi-dimensional space in some way. Now, this has nothing to do with ESP or anything. That's pure ways to understand this vast difference in order of magnitudes between two of the most fundamental things in physics. So to explain that big of a difference, they're struggling to find some radically new mechanism. And they come up with multiple dimensions beyond the four that we know, and ways of doing that. Not been proven, of course, but that's a way of thinking. So my second hypothesis would be that if it's real and you have no differentiation between space and time, because precognition is effect over time, and clairvoyance or telepathy is effect over space. So basically we're saying ESP, if it's real to the degree that it's real, it's operating independent of space and time.
Let's make that even more complicated, because any precognition experiment is both a space and a time separation experiment, because the Earth has moved several thousand miles by the time the information is created in the future. Yeah.
I thought of that.
I'll add a third hypothesis here, that this is going to call for a state-specific science to really make a difference in the end. And you probably know about my paper on the creation of state-specific sciences back in 1970, something like that. In altered states of consciousness, such as might be produced by meditation, psychedelic drugs, or things like that, sometimes there are totally different ways of thinking. So my hope is that a state-specific science will make sense of this someday, make sense of it, and by which I mean not only will it be understandable to at least the people trained in going into that particular altered state, but they'll then be able to actually manipulate the effect and prove that they have some control over it. You know, like some people say, I've got a better radio system and I can prove it because you can hear me on the other side of the earth instead of just a block down the street or something like that.
Go ahead.
I was told that Einstein, for instance, was very much a tactile kind of thinker. He had some imagery that was about how things felt. And he apparently did a lot of his creative thinking that way. he had to turn it back into mathematics at the end to publish it for other people because we're not trained in how to communicate tactually, that sort of thing. But he may have been working in a different kind of state of consciousness that way. I've had indications from a number of scientists in various other fields that when they're actually working in a discovery kind of way, their mind works in an entirely different way from normal. But they can't say that when they actually publish their paper. They've got to go through the proper forms and make it reasonable sounding and logical and so forth. And they can produce results from it. That may be what gets developed, but that's a hope on the future. I don't know whether that'll work now or not.
If it's the case that ESP is real to some degree, if it's real to some degree, it's real and it needs to be explained, and it is independent of space and time, as we've said, whether it's precognition or any clairvoyance, telepathy, and we start searching for new ways of measuring things. Is the work that you've done and pioneered in altered states of consciousness, whether it's meditation or psychedelics or sleep or other different kinds of altered states, does that have, could there be some nexus between the two? And if there is, do you see enhancement of ESP phenomena in altered states?
I hope so. I'm not going to make that big a deal out of my work in altered states. It's not like I've discovered all sorts of things so much as what I've been able to do has been able to show that it's reasonable to study altered states and begin finding out things. But I don't think we know very much yet. But I think that may indeed make a difference. I'm waiting for a good example to pop into my head. Okay, here's an interesting example. It's not quite there. I was giving a lecture on altered states of consciousness and on my altered states of consciousness class at UC Davis once, and I was talking about dreams. And I made a point that dreams are not just sort of random imagery. And I thought, that's a kind of abstract statement. How can I give an example of that? And I sort of, I need an example. And so I said, oh, it's not like you dream about a gorilla, a Volkswagen, and an ice cream cone. There's a plot to things, they go together. And I went on with my lecture. And at the end of the lecture, a young woman came up to me and said quite indignantly, where did you get that example from? I just made it up. She said, well, I used to have this recurring dream about how we'd been out to get some ice cream, and then this gorilla was coming down the street, and I was hiding in our Volkswagen, and we didn't even own a Volkswagen. I said, oh. For a moment, my mind was in some kind of different mode, okay? I couldn't prove this was ESP or make that claim or a particular, it was all too fast, but something allowed parts of the mind to work that don't normally work that way. A lot of creativity works that way. They don't teach you how to be creative when you study a science. They assume it happens. It might work a lot better if they taught you to go into altered states and see things from a quite different perspective.
The alternative explanation for that very striking example is that there are hundreds of trillions of examples like that that did not occur. And when one does occur, it affects you emotionally, and well should. But if you understood that in the context of the hundreds and trillions, and that's a small number compared to what it really is, for all the different possibilities that did not occur, it would just be a random event.
Sounds like an excellent psychological defense mechanism to not have to deal with certain kinds of data. I had enough clinical psychology to know that we defend our beliefs and our attitudes very, very effectively.
You've done some work in studying in out of the body experiments, OBE.
Yeah.
What can you? How does that affect the entire field? What can we learn from that?
Well, I got interested in out of the body experiences from coming across a book by a guy who was a young man at the time, and he started having them spontaneously. This was back in the 1930s, I think, something like that. And I liked his attitude. He said, you know, you'll think I'm nuts when I describe how my mind went out of my body and I went different places and did different things and all that. And I understand it's a perfectly nutty idea, but this is what happened to me. And here in this book, I'm going to tell you as carefully and as accurately as I can what happened and what were some of the things that seemed to affect so that I would have an out of the body experience. So for instance, he said, he came up with a basic rule that if you really, really, really want to go somewhere and your body is so relaxed it can't respond, like in really deep sleep, you may leave your body. And said, if you want to try it, have nothing to drink all day and have a nice glass of warm salt water before bedtime. And you might wake up in the middle of the night finding yourself trying to turn on the sink, but your body's back in bed. Uh, But the important thing about out of the body experiences is that people who have them usually end up saying something like, I don't believe that I'm going to survive death. I know I'm going to survive death. I've been out of my body and my mind was still me. It was working fine and so forth. I don't care about your arguments and so forth. Well, that's a tremendous conviction to have. That changes the way people live their lives. Is that just a delusion? Could be. I mean, from the outside, you can say, yeah, you're crazy. But for people who have it, that's almost always the kind of thing they can include. Knowledge of out of the body experience was pretty rare, usually from people who just had personal experience. But what I was able to do was bring this woman into the laboratory and show that this really exotic, strange thing could happen under laboratory conditions. And I could measure her brainwaves. I found out she showed an unusual brainwave pattern. I showed this particular brainwave tracing to one of the leading world experts on sleep EEGs. We both agreed. That's weird. Never saw anything like that. It contains a suggestion of activity that might promote out of the body experiences. I don't know. But also, to get at the ESP part of it, I did have a number up on a shelf near the ceiling. So if she floated up near the ceiling, she'd be able to read the number, but it wasn't readable from in the room. On only one occasion did she say she got in the right position up near the ceiling to see it. And she correctly said, that's 25132. I think that's 100,000 to 1 odds. Not bad.
Yeah,
I do not claim that was proof of ESP. That was one experiment, but it shows you can test this sort of thing. And so here's something that convinces people they're going to survive death. Wouldn't it be nice to have more factual information about what goes on?
and when you have one example, there could be all sorts of trickery. You could have been sleeping, she could have stood up, or who knows what, or had some mirror.
People, when I have talked about this in lecture, somebody invariably says, did you know the target number? And when I say yes, they say, she didn't leave her body, it was just telepathy.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't think the control for mere telepathy. Really me.
Right. Charlie, let's say that ESP is true as you claim it to be. What would be the implications for human existence, for human consciousness? It would seem to be pretty fundamental.
Well, the way I usually think about it is that most people have adopted a pretty materialistic attitude and think that science supports this as the final answer. You exist because a lot of molecules kept bumping into each other accidentally for a zillion years, and some of them stuck together, and now it's you. But that's all you are. You're just a meat computer. And when the meat computer comes apart, you're gone. So live, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. And if other people are just meat computers too, well, why not use them to the way that's most advantageous to you? It doesn't force you to that kind of morality, but it makes it very easy to just exploit people and not care about it. On the other hand, if ESP says these religions that say we're deeply connected in some higher way have any truth in them, maybe it's kind of dumb to hurt somebody else. It's not that an angry God will punish me if I'm mean to somebody else. It's that in some sense of a connection that will affect me also. I think it provides a basis for taking a lot of religions seriously. Now, that doesn't mean that there's any proof that any particular religion is true in its particulars, but it says that in general there's something. So one particular example, if you're a materialist and you think about somebody saying a prayer, they're talking to themselves. End of story, right? If they pray out loud, it can be heard in the room they're in, and then it falls off at the square of the distance. They're just wasting their breath. But if you look at all these telepathy experiments, one person's intentions or mental content can sometimes be picked up by another person off at a distance. Maybe there's something, maybe you should just throw out the idea of prayer a priori. Maybe you should look at what it does and doesn't do and things like that. I believe in applying basic scientific method to getting more factual answers on these things, not just getting over attached to our theories.
You've made the statement that I posit, meaning you, I posit experience as one kind of fundamental data. What do you mean by that?
I don't know what you mean. Say that again.
Okay. You've made the statement, I'm quoting you now. This is from I think, your essay in Journal of Scientific Exploration. I posit experience as one kind of fundamental data.
Ah, yes. And it's much more difficult to study than physical things, okay? If I want to know what the circuitry in this machine is doing, I can take out meters of one sort or another, learn all sorts of things. My attitude doesn't particularly matter. But if I ask you, what exactly are you feeling right now? You may not know, or you may try to describe it and it's changing even as you talk about it. It's much harder to study experience because it's much more fluid. On the other hand, our experience is what drives our lives. You're angry at someone, you kill them. The experience that leads up to that is important. You're in another way, you're compassionate toward them. I think experience has to be taken as basic reality also. And let's see what we can learn from studying it better. As it is, we pay no attention to it. Behaviorism was so strong in psychology for years. They sort of thought it was a disadvantage that people could talk. That confused people.
To make experience as fundamental, what does that, is that a claim that consciousness is in some sense itself fundamental, and as is being discussed in philosophy of mind, whether it's panpsychism or some variant, or idealism, where consciousness is the only thing, does your claim that experience is fundamental support consciousness as part of the foundational structure of existence?
Yes, except if I use the word fundamental, I'm sorry I used it. By fundamental, I mean we should pay close attention to it and study it.
Okay.
If by fundamental, I mean I know the absolute truth about the way things are forever and ever, that's nonsensical. What's fundamental or not fundamental in a dozen years from now even may change drastically. But to simply say, forget about it, we'll just keep measuring the brain waves and the neurochemicals and then we'll understand everything, I think we're missing out on a really important part of life.
Charlie, you've been at this for as long as I've been following it, which is more than 50 years, and maybe you're getting close to 60 years. I would just love to hear your kind of overarching reflections on the experiences that you've had in parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, altered states of consciousness, this whole realm of areas that are beyond traditional science.
Well, it's funny because on the one hand, I'd say I'm a very practical person. I'm in pretty good touch with ordinary reality and maneuver quite well in it. At the same time, I was always interested in dreams. Oh, what was this stuff that went on during the night? Why didn't people pay any attention to it? That was funny. how come I would do really stupid things because I felt like it at the time? How could emotions change the way you perceive the world and act on the world so drastically? And then during graduate school, I was a subject in psychedelic drug experiments that the psychiatrist was doing. And so I saw the drastic changes that could take place in the way my mind worked. And it made me realize that, yeah, here in ordinary reality, where as far as I know I am right now, things operate in a certain kind of way, but they can change drastically. Like William James put it, the right stimulus comes along and you can see everything in a totally different sort of way. Some of those ways may be illusions, but Lord knows we have enough illusions in our ordinary state also. Some of them may be deep insights into some aspect of reality. Let's look at them all. But what we shouldn't do is pretend they're not there. To pretend that we're just rational and then be very puzzled when we're not rational. To think that we can teach people to be scientists without teaching them to be creative, it's just a matter of measuring it. I'm not answering your question in a way because it's given me a bigger and bigger picture of what the possibilities are, even though I live in a relatively well-bounded, practical side of it.
Yeah, you look pretty normal.
Yeah,
On the surface, you could fool anybody.
I haven't had a haircut in 6 months because of the COVID virus. Okay, that's being practical.
Do you have any regrets? Do you have any regrets over the years, scientifically speaking, or looking at the field?
No, not really. I mean, I've lived a very interesting life in some ways. There have been times I think I've been treated very badly because of my research interests, and maybe I could have done more if that hadn't been the case. But hey, things were what they were, and what good would feeling bad about it do?
Mm. If we were going to reschedule ourselves, not another 13 years, but let's just say another 50 years from today, and we sat down, your hair was a little longer, my hair maybe a little bit whiter, 50 years from today, and we look back, what would you hypothesize now would be our conversation 50 years from today about these areas of parapsychology and ESP?
I don't think we'd be talking about whether there were parapsychological phenomena. I think it's likely that we will get them under enough practical control that they'll simply be accepted. And, the intelligence agencies should be using remote viewing regularly. It works well enough. So we'd be talking more about the deeper meaning of this and thinking how much smarter we were, but hopefully also remembering that's just our best guess at the time being. That's what I try to remember. I think I got some things figured out, but I don't really know it. It may be different. So keep looking at what actually happens.
Well, put it on your calendar. 50 years from today, we're going to do this again.
Will do. It's been a pleasure, Robert.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing.